All right, hello, beautiful friends. We're here to finish up our talking about the autonomic nervous system, which we didn't have quite enough time for today. So we've been talking about this question: how would the heart's rate of beating be affected by treating it directly with norepinephrine or with acetylcholine? Before we did this question, we reminded y'all that there are two neurons in each chain for both the parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. And you might say, who cares? And really, I agree with you. Who cares? That really doesn't matter from the point of view of any meaning, conceptual stuff. But the reason it matters is because they're transmitters, neurotransmitters, of course, that act at each of these two synapses, the synapse at the ganglion and then at the target organ. See that those little circles are neurotransmitter being released in each place. And so in real life, drugs that mimic or block this neurotransmitter or this neurotransmitter are going to have effects in your body. And loads of the drugs that we use to treat people for all kinds of things are drugs that affect this and affect that. So that's important because drugs are important, and if you're going to go into medicine, that's important. And it's important just to understand how the system works. So if we go back to this question and say, okay, so what's going to happen with these two neurotransmitters? And what you have to have simply memorized really is which neurotransmitter is associated with which system. So we talk about epinephrine being associated with the sympathetic nervous system, but that's really the hormone that acts in that system, and norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter. In terms of how they act, norepinephrine and epinephrine, same thing. You can really mash them together in your head for now. That's completely fine. So this is the sympathetic system, and norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter at the target organ, right? And that was on the categorizing grid we did. We talked about that briefly. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter there, whereas acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that acts at the end of the parasympathetic network. Acetylcholine also acts at both synapses here, but it acts at a different receptor. All right, so this figure, you should just basically memorize the facts in this figure. It's one of the goals for this chapter. You should know that. Okay? And this is a kind of fact you should know definitely for the quiz. As we move forward through this video, there's some things that really you would only really be asked to do on the team application. Okay? So check this out. So basically you need to memorize those transmitters. It's not so bad. There's only two neurotransmitters, right? And where they are. And if we go back to the heart question then, we now know that norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter that acts on the heart from the sympathetic nervous system, and acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system. And of course, as you already identified easily on the categorizing grid, you know that the sympathetic nervous system will increase heart rate and acetylcholine will decrease, and the parasympathetic will decrease it, which leads us to choice C. As class ended, though, we made things more complicated by showing you, I showed you this slide, but we didn't have time to discuss it. So here you have a situation where you're wanting to lower heart rate. So we're still talking about heart rate, one thing, and we know, you already know, that the system that would slow down heart rate would be the parasympathetic nervous system, and the sympathetic would speed it up. So if we're going to slow down his heart rate, we need to give him a drug either that activates the parasympathetic nervous system or inhibits the sympathetic nervous system, and either one of those should work because at rest you're going to have some activation of both systems. Now you might look at these and be like, how the heck am I supposed to know what any of those drugs do? Well, you don't have to memorize what these drugs do, but there is a lovely table in your book which you would be expected to use, for example, during the team application, which would allow you to answer this type of question. So if we look at this and say, okay, we're going to try to slow down Mr. Yin's heart rate, would alpha bungarotoxin work? Well, alpha bungarotoxin is here. It is an antagonist to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So this is not going to be a good choice for us because both systems, remember from this slide, that the nicotinic receptor, which is a kind of acetylcholine receptor, operates in both systems. So if you block that receptor, it's going to sort of equally affect both of them. It's an antagonist, so it's going to block that receptor. It's going to equally block both of them. So not the best drug for this system. We want to really preferentially activate the parasympathetic nervous system here. So then you look at cocaine, and we go back to our table here. Cocaine actually has many effects, but one of its major effects is to prevent norepinephrine from being taken back up into the cells that release it. So its effect is to prolong the action of norepinephrine. Well, that's not what we want either, right? Because that would prolong the action of the sympathetic nervous system, which would speed up his heart rate. So that brings us to neostigmine, choice C. And that's up here. It's an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, not an acetylcholine inhibitor, an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. Acetylcholine esterase is the enzyme that breaks up acetylcholine, which is something you have to know for this unit. And so because acetylcholinesterase breaks up acetylcholine, if we're going to block it, then that will prolong the action of acetylcholine. So it's kind of like what cocaine does for norepinephrine. Does the same thing for acetylcholine. So we're going to have more acetylcholine action. If this drug acts directly on his heart, then that should work because the acetylcholine, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so by activating the acetylcholine there, or letting it last longer, then we should preferentially activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, it's true that you're also activating the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system at the ganglion, but those effects should theoretically cancel out, and the major effect that you're going to have is the effect that's preferentially activating the parasympathetic nervous system there. Okay, so what's our last choice? Was propranolol. So if we go back here, propranolol is a beta blocker. So it's going to block beta adrenergic receptors, which is a kind of epinephrine receptor. And if you block epinephrine receptors, then you should slow down heart rate because epinephrine and norepinephrine should increase heart rate normally. So choices C and D should both be drugs that are able to slow down Mr. Yin's heart rate. And one of them might be preferable over the other in real life, but from a basic introduction point of view from this class, you could argue that either one of those could be effective. Now, you can use this table to answer this question, which is the similar one to the first one that we just did, but I'll leave it to you to decide which of these drugs would work, and I will tell you the answer. But I think it's first a chance for you to go see if you can find out, compare answers with each other if you're talking to your teammates about this, and then ask me to confirm that your reasoning is correct. The last one on here that I had is really a simpler question about asthma patients, which indeed, unlike the other two, this is not a made-up thing. These patients suffer from constriction of their breathing tubes from their bronchioles, and there are various treatments available. This you don't have to know what the drugs are, so you don't have to look them up on a table. So this is the kind of thing I could ask you on the quiz, for example. You have to remember what the words agonist and antagonist mean, and you have to know where the muscarinic versus nicotinic receptors are. I guess alpha and beta, I wouldn't expect you to know. I don't think you have to know the difference between alpha and beta. So that's the kind of thing that you could look up in the book on a TMAP or something like that. But still, I think you can make progress on this without knowing that. If their bronchial smooth muscle constricts, then what we're hoping to do is dilate it to open the tubes in their lungs, and that's something the sympathetic nervous system would do, right? Because you want more air when you're breathing a lot of oxygen, air in to get the oxygen to run away from the puma and get rid of the carbon dioxide, and so on. So if you had an agonist, remember that means to activate it, for muscarinic acetylcholine receptors, such as muscarine, then you're activating the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Because muscarinic acetylcholine receptors are what the parasympathetic nervous system uses at its target organ. Okay, that's not good. We want to activate the sympathetic nervous system. An antagonist for adrenergic receptors. So we're blocking something sympathetic, right? Adrenergic is sympathetic. We don't want to block the sympathetic. We want sympathetic. There's an agonist for beta adrenergic receptors. Well, that sounds better. We're activating something that is sympathetic. Or an antagonist for nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And that's no good because remember, the nicotinic ones are the ones that both systems use. So an antagonist is really going to equally affect both systems. And so it won't have the effect that we want. So C is the best choice for this one. I know this stuff can be confusing, but honestly, if you just go back to this and learn it, all the drugs simply affect either these receptors or here or here. There's just really 3 possible things that you could affect, and then you could either activate them with an agonist or inhibit them with an antagonist. So it's all very susceptible to logic once you understand figure 11.6. And once again, I probably wouldn't ask you something like this except on a TMAP or without providing you with enough information to answer it. You do not need to memorize what all those drugs do. You do need to know this, and you need to know this, which is a simpler version of the previous one. And you need to know what acetylcholine, that acetylcholine is broken up by acetylcholine esterase in the synapse. That's part of the deal. Okay, so that's all for now, and let me know if you have questions about this. See you in a couple days.